Thanks for joining us today for our second annual virtual expo. My name is Adrienne Moreno, and I'll be hosting a Q&A session with Viswadeb Ganguly. Viswadeb and I work closely together as members of our applications development team. Our group has a particular focus on the energy transition to support growth not just for Flowserve, but for our customers and end users who will be navigating the changing energy landscape with us. This change will present a unique challenge and opportunities for collaboration and innovation. And we are excited hearing questions from you in the chat. Hello, VG. How are you today?
Hello, Adrienne. Glad to be here with you today. Looking forward to the conversation.
I'm looking forward to our conversation as well. So let's get started. What are some of the technologies you see fueling growth in the energy transition space over the next 5 to 20 years as the world shifts from fossil to renewable sources? This could include carbon capture, utilization, and storage, sometimes referred to as CCUS, sustainable fuels, hydrogen production and adoption, as well as novel approaches to plastics recycling.
That's a great question to start the conversation, Adrienne. The way we are seeing it, any new technology, when it has to be adopted, it goes through a classical process of early adopters. Then we have a chasm when the technology becomes more matured, acceptable, and economically viable, and then it becomes mainstream with a larger population. So the way we have seen is that any technology to become mainstream, it has to perform three prerequisites. One is the technology has to be transferable and robust. The second piece is that it has to be economically viable. And the third piece is it has to be easy for adoption in the given context. Now, the way I see the decarbonization, it's a three-dimensional journey. One leg is the amount of CO2 we are absorbing or trying to absorb. The second is the time dimension, that in the period of time in which we are going to handle it. And third is the geographic stream, across the globe. Now, the early indicators suggest that all these technologies that you mentioned are being picked up in different parts of the world based on their structural and environmental and economical context. So in essence, what I'm trying to say that all these technologies are being adopted, but the scale of adoption will happen with time and the economics as they become more dominant.
All right, VG. So you started to speak a little bit about some of the challenges that these new technologies could bring. What do you see as the biggest challenges facing the energy transition movement, not just for Flowserve, but for the whole energy industry?
You see, if you take each of the energy transition lane, the challenges are different. Okay, if you say the complete renewable like solar or wind, there the challenge could be grid congestion and energy storage. But however, one common theme that is emerging is basically the funding of these aspirations. The reason is that many of the technologies like in CCUS or for that matter, hydrogen, are mature technologies which are currently being considered to be used in a different environment, whereas these technologies originally were not developed for this purpose. So there has to be an economic viability for these technologies to become mainstream, and that requires investment as well. So if we have to have a global decarbonization strategy, necessarily these technologies have to meet the economic point at which it becomes acceptable across the globe. At this point, what we are seeing that most of the initiatives are either state funded or they are backed up by some kind of a fund, which is possible in some part of the world, but it's not transferable to other more developing nations. So the way I see it, the funding gap is the biggest challenge in the short run.
All right, so as these technologies come into acceptance in this mid and long-term timeline, what do you see happening to conventional oil and gas sources of energy? Do you see them going into a fast decline and potentially creating a vacuum that's left unfilled? Or do you see an orderly retreat of these conventional energy sources as we see these technologies come into play?
That's a very good question, Adrian. I think the first key element of this conversation is that how human behavior evolves with time. Because until and unless we as human population becomes aware of this energy impact of our everyday life, things are not going to change drastically. However, we need to understand that decarbonization is a commitment and it has to go through an adaptive process because any transformational initiative by any part of the geography or society will have a tremendous social and economic cost. So, a more pragmatic way to look into this energy transition is that there could be sustainable, incremental, and sizable investment in energy transition pathways, which are sufficiently large enough to invest for the step up technologies to be incubated and practiced, but at the same time fulfilling the overall objective. So, in that kind of a scenario, which is incremental and adaptive, I see that for quite some time now in the future, the core industries of oil and gas will sustain, but then they will be gradually replaced in an orderly fashion with the more environmentally sustainable options. So that is how I see it playing out more realistically in the next 15 to 20 years.
All right, thank you for your perspective on that, VG. So as we know, there's a little bit of turmoil today within the world of global politics. Do you see a fast development of alternative energy sources with this turmoil, or does the race to sustainability slow down and countries to continue to rely on those conventional energy sources?
Yeah, I have a feeling that's a very important topic today. But I would like to stay out of the political discussion and rather focus on what organizations can do or looking into this current scenario. So, one of the things that organizations need to embed is that we have to be agile and learning with the environment we are living in. Okay. So, two of the key themes that are emerging out of the current geopolitical context are one is the supply chain. Now, this is a very key element because there are some early indicators that supply chain is going through a process of adjustment, and we need to be mindful if these changes are actually long-term systemic changes. If that is the case, then necessarily we are looking at quite a few manufacturing options being shifted back into West and back home, which then changes the carbon intensity or the carbon mix of those economies. The second piece is that in the geopolitical context, we need to observe how the energy mix of certain geographies and nations are getting adjusted because of the cost of feedstock like LNG or crude oil, and these will have an impact of how the carbon intensity of various industries and population at large are going to play out. So we are currently in a very transitory environment, and organizations need to be very agile, adaptive, and develop their strategy. There is a lot of noise in the market at this time, but for proper strategic planning, we need to tune out the noise from our planning purposes and focus on the emerging and sustainable trends in this whole game.
Okay, so I want to keep in line with the idea of global and regional issues. How do you see other geographies of the world adopting carbon reduction efforts? For example, how do you see Asia Pacific comparing to North America or Latin America comparing to EMA?
So, the common topic of discussion in energy transition is that whether it's an economic value add to business or it's just a liability. At the overall end game, I think the digitization, decarbonization initiatives for most organizations will be an economic value add. But we have to go through a transition in before we reach there. And to reach there, I think the multinational companies and the international companies which have business across geographies are better placed to adapt to these changing environment because in some part of the world, the current economic construct, the subsidization, the infrastructure promotes these energy transition technology, not so much in the other part. So, in essence, the surplus of implementing these projects is not visible in certain parts of the world, Whereas these multinational or international companies, what they could do, they can gain the positives from one part of the geography and cross subsidize their investment in other part of the world and accelerate this journey.
Okay, so for the next question, I'd also like to loop in a question we've had from our audience here. So what I'd like to know is, what do you suggest to a company that is trying to begin their decarbonization journey? How can they get started? And to bring in our comment from Steve, how do you think these companies can really set themselves up for success in a very dynamic environment?
It's a very valid question, and I would like to put it in this way. We can pick up things which the tools that are already available with us. And the two very easy to adopt tools are, one is digitization and the other is efficiency improvement. So if we plan the business processes and embed them as a part of the KPIs, both these parameters, we and what does get measured gets controlled. So digitization and decarbonization through efficiency improvement could be the two easy low-hanging fruits for any organization to adopt. In case of Flowserve, what we are doing, we are following a concept called decarbonization by design, in which when we pick up our products, we are basically putting our KPIs in the product design phase in such a way that when the end product comes out, it will be a step up product for the customers to enjoy and reap benefits out of it in their decarbonization journey. So that's how I think is a very easy way to adapt to this changing environment.
Okay, so you've touched a little bit on this conversation on the concept of ESG, which is environmental, social, and corporate governance. The Harvard Business Review published an article titled "The Future of ESG is Accounting," which comments on the lack of universally adopted standards for how companies can measure and communicate their sustainability performance. What are your takeaways from this particular article?
ESG is a journey, and I think many organizations are in different stages of their maturity. At this point in time, I don't think there is an universal standard of ESG compliance, but then the main crux of the matter is that why would organization practice ESG? And I think rather than looking into it more from a virtuous perspective, it is better to see whether it's an economic value add to the business process or it is a liability. The the early indications are quite convincing that if the ESG plans for the organizations are well thought out and aligned with their overall business objectives, the ESG can be a tool of enhancing organization performance. I am not so much worried about that, there is not a universal standard of ESG adoption. Any early practice requires some time to come to a maturity when it becomes prevalent and the world has a standard procedures and practices. But certain organizations are embracing it wholeheartedly, like in Flowserve. We have a good ESG program. We have released our ESG report earlier this year, and it is very well aligned with our business processes. And I think it's very advantageous for organizations to follow it.
Okay, thanks, VG. That's a very interesting perspective, and it will be great to see how this continues to evolve. So here at Flowserve, we use our 3D initiative, which stands for diversification, decarbonization, and digitization, as a guiding principle. How does our guiding principle tie into the future of the global energy transition?
That's a very interesting question. The biggest challenge for any organization in this energy transition space is to understand this huge thing that is going on. There is so much of information and to find meaningful, actionable pathways for that. And I think 3D, diversification, decarbonization, and digitization are very interesting and structured roadmap for Flowserve to follow. In the diversification space, what we are doing, we are selectively identifying domain which have a significant growth potential and sustainable approach, and we are preparing the organizations to cater to that market. In the decarbonization, as one of my earlier participant also observed in the keynote address, is that decarbonization, you have something called a transitory phase, which is very well backed by LNG. So Flowserve has a significant presence in the LNG value chain where we participate big time, and we have some very innovative offering in that area. Along with that, we are very strong in CCS, carbon capture sequestration area. We are very well knowledgeable in handling supercritical CO2 liquid phase. We have good knowledge and understanding around hydrogen and ammonia and methanol. And we see all these energy vectors becoming on stream and more readily practiced and adopted. And Flowserve is uniquely positioned to leverage these spaces. And the third piece of Flowserve's journey is the digitization. We are already aware that we have invested, it's a huge investment in Red Raven, where we are helping our customers to become more productive, more reliable, improving their on-stream factors, so that maintenance moves from a more reactive planning to a more proactive planning and helps them to improve their efficiency, which is again a method of decarbonization. And the icing on the cake for Flowserve is the newly conceived Energy Advantage program, which will help our target customers, end user, existing install base to become more efficient in their journey. So I think as an organization, we are uniquely placed with the right strategies and the right intent to cater to these growing market. And I'm very excited about this space, to be honest.
All right, very exciting there, VG. So I'm going to take another question from the audience and ask you, of all the different lanes that exist within the energy transition, for example, carbon capture, hydrogen, sustainable fuels, which do you think is going to have the fastest adoption rate?
Well, it's a tricky question, and I would say that it will be very heavily dependent on the natural endowment for a particular geography, and also the way the industries and the consumers are organized. Let's say a country like India. So India traditionally imports a lot of crude oil and their natural gas requirement for the industry by default. So if India wants to go for a decarbonization strategy, a logical route would be to follow either LNG, or which displaces coal to reduce the carbon intensity, or for that matter, directly go to green hydrogen, because blue hydrogen for India will not be very attractive, because as it is, they are importing bulk of the hydrocarbons. And that's the early trends we are finding. If you look into India's energy policy mix that has been released, they are looking into green hydrogen in a big way. And along with that, they are looking into LNG. So that's how, but that's a geographical construct. So in different part of the world, in US, you will see more of blue hydrogen. In case of Europe and Western Europe, you may find that there will be more of sustainable fuels and green hydrogen in the same way. It's a complex question to answer, and I would leave it at that it would be dependent on geography and natural endowment for that region.
All right, well, thank you very much for your time, Viswadeb, in addressing all of these interesting topics. And thank you for entering your questions into the chat. VG and I will take some time after this session to go back and address anything that's open. The challenges presented by the energy transition can be daunting, but it will allow for innovation across the industry. People from different sectors and experience levels will need to come together to make the world better for everyone. By defining sustainability goals and metrics, we can hold ourselves accountable to both big and small changes, so we are always improving. Armed with Flowserve's 3Ds, we will continue to lead the way with our exceptional flow control technology. Thank you, and back to you, Lars.